Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 10, the last lecture for Human Motor Control and Learning. I hope that you all have enjoyed the course. I hope that sort of the main topics through the curriculum for the course are sort of giving you some aha moments, or they're applicable to things that you notice in daily life, with it be with other courses or with like your jobs or training or coaching, or working in a clinic if you do. I do find that the material is applicable to versus other courses. I do find this material is applicable to things that you will see in the future. So hopefully you'll have some of those moments, and then it was all worth it. Before we get started with the lecture, I just wanted to sort of reiterate again that the final exam is through Canvas and sort of Respondus. It's on the 24th, which is a Sunday, which I found unique, but that's what it's listed. Don't forget that the assignment is due. Has anyone started it? Has anyone completed it? The feedback that I've gotten is that once you get started, it finishes pretty quickly. The rubric, a sample assignment, and the grading key is all listed on in one of those modules. And so just make sure you go through it and understand specifically how you'll be marked, because then it'll sort of help you tailor your assignment to get completed. Okay, good. Joshua's almost halfway done. What, any feedback, Joshua, about the assignment? Yeah, there's almost too much information to complete it. Like you go on and on and on and on and on about all the different things we've talked about in the course applied to whatever motor skill that you are discussing. But just make sure that you follow the rubric so you can like just be efficient with it. Okay, good. Don't forget the lab is due on the 19th. There's those mini quizzes or quizzes, complete those as well. And then the breakdown for the final exam is listed, as well as a review lecture. So just this, I put together some slides to kind of like put together the take-home points from the course, so that way you kind of get an understanding or a idea of what the main outline of the course material is, and then you can take all of the different examples that we've talked about and apply it to the backbone of the course. So in a way, I'm trying to help you chunk the information, especially since it's information heavy. So if you think about this course, that hopefully as you're reading through the lecture, specifically in the motor learning component, it's like repeating the same sort of thing, right? Like remember, paying attention to what you're doing is important with learning, or the cognitive process of the trial and error and problem solving is what leads to better learning. Like, it's the same thing over and over and over again. And hopefully with chunking, it decreases the amount that you feel the information you have to take in, because then it's more like, this is just another example of the one thing I've learned. So instead of having 10 things to learn, it's 10 examples of one concept. And maybe that is what got across better in person. The other thing too is that this course used to be a 3rd-year course. So maybe the timing of it has altered it, the comprehension or the feeling of the amount of information. So in today's lecture, what we're going to be doing is finishing up with motor learning, and we're going to be talking about the decision to practice in whole or in parts. And so, oops, it's not. There you go. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the specifics of when to practice a motor skill in whole versus when to practice it in individual parts. And we'll talk about those concepts and what that means. We're going to talk about the terms complexity and organization, and that's going to help us make a decision of whether or not we want to practice a motor skill or teach a motor skill in parts or in whole. We're going to talk about ways to divide up a motor skill into parts and some of the factors or variables behind that if you so decide to practice parts of a motor skill or have participants practice parts of a motor skill. And then we'll finish up with talking about mental practice and imagery and how imagining performing a motor skill, does that help with motor skill learning? And is it efficient use of time? Any questions before we get started? Okay. So think about a motor skill that you are teaching a class. Any coaches? I ask every week, but any coaches or trainers? Any dancers? Any gymnasts? When you are teaching a motor skill, do you teach it in parts or do you teach it in whole? So think about when you teach a dance routine, do you teach the learner from beginning to end and then practice beginning to end, or do you practice like little bits and put it together? So everyone's saying parts. Okay, and I think that that's something we can all agree on. You definitely go through different parts, right? And so if that's the case, why is it better? And so research or motor learning research has looked into what are the factors in deciding whether or not we teach something in whole or we teach it in parts. Because there are, it obviously depends, right? It's going to depend on the task, because some things it's hard to break down. Maybe they're too easy that you can teach them in a whole, and by breaking it up, it doesn't foster any more learning, right? If I was going to teach you a jump shot, am I going to teach you to jump, then to raise your arm, and then to hold, like shoot a ball? It depends on the skill, and we're going to understand or learn about some of the factors to consider when deciding. The decision to teach things in whole or in parts is going to be based on the complexity and organization characteristics of the skill. And I do want to say one thing is that what is one thing that we've learned throughout the motor learning component of this course is that you can maybe do one way earlier in practice and then transition to a different way. Just when we were talking about random practice versus block practice last day. So by definition, whole practice is a practice strategy that involves practicing the skill from beginning to end. Okay, so my dance example would be practicing the dance routine from beginning to end over and over again. That's each repetition of the practice trials. Okay, part practice then is practicing parts of the skill before practicing the whole skill. And so this would be learning a dance routine in parts and then putting it together. Now, this practice, part practice, was what a lot of us were talking about utilizing the most in our experience. And it may be because that the experiences that stick out for us are complex skills or sport skills or athletics. So the terms complexity and organization are different than the term difficulty that we learned way back at the beginning of the course. Difficulty related to Fitt's law and was sort of a calculation for index of difficulty to sort of quantify the difficulty in reaching and pointing tasks. Complexity and organization are different terms, and they relate to the skill and our decision to practice it in whole or in parts. Complexity describes the number of components of a skill and the degree of information processing required in each of those individual parts. So a highly complex skill would have a lot of parts that require a lot of attention. So it's more complex. So I think for a dance routine that involves a whole bunch of different dance moves, that would be classified as a highly complex task or complex skill. Organization sort of revolves around this idea of the relationships between the components of the skill. So a high level of organization or a highly organized skill means that the parts of the skill are interdependent. They can't be separated, more or less. So if we think of my example of a jump shot, could you practice or separate the individual components of that skill easily? Probably not. So if you're going to teach a jump shot, are you going to teach them jumping, teach them holding a ball, raising their arm, throwing the ball? It seems like everything's interdependent on each other. So a highly organized skill, all the components are sort of interdependent on each other. Does that make sense? Whereas a skill that is low in complexity means that the components of the motor skill are independent of each other, such as that US Army example that we talked about, I think, last class, where it was taking a gun apart, cleaning it, and putting it back together. Individually, those components could be separated in practice. There's a very good structure to it. And we see that in serial motor skills. So those would have a low level of organization because the individual components are independent of each other. Does that make sense, everyone? So the rule goes that if there is a skill that is low in complexity and high in organization, you practice the whole skill. If the skill is high in complexity and low in organization, then you practice using the part method. But like everything, it's a spectrum, and that spectrum can change throughout the stages of motor learning. Right? So this could be a way to consider the beginning stages of, practicing the motor skill. So if we look at this hypothetical sort of like spectrum diagram here, we have complexity and organization on the axes and then low versus high. So if we have a high level of organization, meaning the parts or components of the skill are interdependent, and the skill is low in complexity, then you practice in the whole method. If it is low in organization and high in complexity, then you do part practice. Discrete skills are probably quicker, so they're lower in complexity, hypothetically. Serial skills seem to be very structured, right? That's the whole point of a serial, like the motor skills on end. So it's like a series of discrete skills, one after another. So those are very low in organization, so they can be separated easily. So they're practiced in parts potentially. But like I said, generally speaking, if the motor skill is low in complexity and high in organization, you can practice it in whole to get the best benefits. And if the skill is high in complexity and low in organization, then you can practice it in parts to better learn. But it's like a spectrum, and you will want to modify as you progress through the stages of learning. So if we've decided to practice in parts, then how do we break it up? So all the examples we talked about in the group chat here, everyone said practicing in parts. And so how do you decide, and what are some of the variables or factors to consider when you break something up into components? I have an example here of gymnasts and utilizing a part method to learn a hypothetically a very complex skill, or like working on the uneven bars. Any gymnasts in the class? No gymnasts. So this is an example of how a gymnastics coach broke up the components to have her students complete the uneven bars. Any gymnasts? No gymnasts. Look at those elbows. That's elbow pain. It's all here. Hello. Oh yeah. I should have put up I follow all those, so I practice those dance moves, by the way. I should have put that up. I just can't get over this girl's elbows. Ah. And so that was casting, I guess, on the uneven bars, and how the coach had the students practicing in parts before putting it all together. And so my question to you is, what are some of the different ways that we could divide up a skill into parts to teach it, if that's how we decide that we want to have the learners practice to maximize their learning or their retention? And so the three main strategies that researchers have talked about are listed on the next couple slides. The first one is fractionization. Has anyone ever heard that term before? And so fractionization is describing a strategy for using or practicing the movements of each limb individually for skills that are an asymmetric coordination skill, meaning skills that require the use of both hands doing different things at once, at the same time. So think about like guitar or piano or violin or I don't know, something else. But in those skills, any guitar players or piano or pianists? When you first learn, did you first start off practicing just one hand, then the other hand, and then put it together? Because when I took guitar lessons, that's what we did. Okay, perfect. So how does that work, Joshua? You just, I'm thinking back to my guitar lessons, but like you practice strumming, practicing fretting, and then sort of put it together. No, or like, I'm not sure. Then I don't play piano, but I can imagine first right hand, then left hand, do both at once. Okay, yeah. So similar. So that's fractionization, and it's a useful method in the beginning stages of learning for asymmetric bimanual tasks. And generally speaking, which hand is the more difficult one? The right hand, right, for pianists, Joshua? Because the general rule is that you want to start practice with the more difficult or complex task and then add in the second one. Literally. So that's called fractionization. Here we have a study that sort of evaluated that. And they did an asymmetric tapping task where you had to, like a piano skill, but you had to tap your fingers to a metronome. So one was on 3 beats, and then you had to like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, like that. And so what they did was they had 3 different groups where you would practice in whole, in parts, and part whole. Part whole was when you did a mild task with the opposite hand while learning the more dominant task. And it found that, so the results of the study were inconclusive, actually. So we're talking about fractionating movement for asymmetric bimanual skills. And if you look at this study, they actually showed that the whole practice group did better than the part group. So the results of this study were inconclusive. The results were not too far apart. So maybe it's going to be dependent on the task, just like Samantha was saying earlier. I think it was Samantha that was saying it. It's going to be very task specific. Fractionization is a popular method for asymmetric bimanual tasks, which is why we all have experience in something like that. But this study did show a benefit of sort of somewhere in the middle. The next strategy that is commonly used in learning is the progressive part strategy. So that's also called segmentation. And so this strategy is a part practice method where you start with one part, practice it, and then sequentially add more and more parts. And I think that's typical of dance routines. I'm not sure if you would all agree with me, but you would practice, part 1, get good at it, then do 1, 2, get good at it, then 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you keep sequentially adding parts. So that's called the progressive part strategy. If you just did part 1, practice, 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 part 2, practice, 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 part 3, practice, 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 and then as you get through all of the parts, then add them together, that would just be part practice. This is a progressive part strategy, so kind of like the halfway method of the previous slide, where you are progressively adding more and more parts. Does that make sense? And it's useful because it takes advantage of both the whole and part practice, because you're practicing in parts, but then adding just another part and then doing that in whole. So it's a kind of both. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay, good. Thanks, John. Oh, JP, there he is. I feel like that the progressive part strategy is pretty common as well. I mean common in examples that we can think of off the top of our head. Can anyone think of one? Let me think. I used to do like what karate when I was a kid. That's how we learned like our katas. Oh, is that yeah? Is that okay? Boxing combos, Matthew's saying. So you would just like learn one combo or one part, and then you do part 1, 2, and then part 1, 2, 3, and then just sequentially keep adding. Okay. And so remember that if we think back to the term complexity, a complex skill has many components that require a lot of attention. So you would break it up into the components that okay, attention is really strongly needed there or there, and that's sort of how you would break it up, I imagine. Okay, that makes sense, Matthew. Thanks. The last method that's used a lot is simplification. And so that's practicing a simpler variation of a skill before practicing the complete skill itself. Now, there's many different ways to simplify a skill to practice before you get into learning the main skill. And I thought about 6 different ways you can sort of simplify a task to do this method or simplification. The first one is you can reduce object difficulty. If you think about the example that I thought about was when we learned volleyball in, I don't know, grade 5 or primary school, we first practiced with the big yellow balls. This is more like a balloon, and then you get used to bumping and serving and sort of diving and stuff. And as you get better at it, then you sort of progress to the main ball or the regular sized volleyball. Any jugglers? Jugglers first learn to juggle with scars because it takes longer for them to fall as they get sort of the rhythm down. Can you think of anything else? Yeah, training wheels on bicycle is a common example. Now remember, so because training wheels on a bicycle are also like applicable to reducing attention demands. So the examples that we're going to come up with can take from many different components. This isn't like these examples that I came up with aren't sort of exclusive. Like grading exercise. What do you mean by grading exercises, Samantha? Like grading where the patient's at in terms of like function? Oh, like grading exercises. Yes, yes. Like Gentile's taxonomy, like stepwise progression. The only thing with this example is I was talking about if they're interacting with an object, they could reduce the difficulty of that object until they get better. So we're all right. Everyone's right. It's just that in this case, remember I say how like it's a volleyball, so you're manipulating an object. You change the difficulty of that object. Technically, with bicycle riding, you're still manipulating an object. So you start off with training wheels, so you can get used to steering and biking or pedaling before you have to worry about balance. This is how little kids learn to be with pipe cleaners. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's perfectly true. Another way to simplify it is to remove attention demands from the skill as they're learning. And so that's what training wheels also does, is that you don't have to concentrate on balance because of the training wheels. You can have the learner focus more on steering and getting used to this idea of pedaling. And as they get used to it, then you can take away the training wheels, and then they can have more tension on that plus keeping balance. Using physical assistance, like the walking rails, or on this slide here, this is where people learn to walk. They're on a harness. So it reduces attention demands at parts of the component so they can focus on other things. So that's helping them. It's decreasing the difficulty of the task. It's helping them up. It's actually for safety as well. But then they can focus on, stepping, focusing their eyes, other parts of the motor skill at the same time. Do you remember the speed accuracy trade-off? You can also start or simplify a motor skill in learning by starting off with a slower version. So you start off with slower speeds, so that the learner would gain accuracy, and then you can speed it up as they develop the invariant features of that task. Trying to think, what is a good example of a motor skill that you first learned slowly? Maybe dance routine. Driving. Handwriting. Yeah, handwriting's a good one. Yep. You get used to the invariant features of like the defining movement characteristics, and then you can start speeding it up. You can add auditory cues. So then we talked about augmented feedback and adding cues and demonstrations. You can add auditory cues, and that's helpful for teaching the routine or the rhythm of a motor skill. Oh yeah, tying shoes, you go slow first, right? You also have like acronyms, or not acronyms, or like sayings, like what was the bunny one? So that you remember it. This is what so this fifth example, that's what you were talking about, Sam. Progressing difficulty. So you start off with a simplified version, and then you incrementally add to the difficulty. You actually want to know what's the most popular right now, where all the funding is going, is in simulators and virtual reality for training. So have you, there's a gaming lab at Ontario Tech, but they do a lot of like sim training for like studying what best training they could provide for like firefighters and for different fields. It's or the sim lab for the nurses and with the patients. The simulation and virtual reality labs and like those options have become like so popular. I don't know if you guys have all seen that, but have you seen the sim labs for like nursing or the at Ontario Tech, where they have the dummies that you can take blood pressure, they have a heart rate, they talk, they have eyes, you can take their vitals. It's really good practice for working with people in a hospital environment. I'd imagine, Matthew, you've seen, yeah. They are very creepy, actually. Very creepy. So, do you remember the term momentary intentions, that if you tell someone to focus on something while they're performing a motor skill, or you want to focus on something while performing a motor skill, you can pay attention to a certain part? This study was looking at it was like a video game. And so the video game, you can't separate. So the video game was like you had to fly like a ship and then like shoot, I guess, aliens or something. And then you could like move the ship, you could shoot, and then you had to deal with like these mines. So there's different components of the game. And so what they did was that you can't separate the game. So what they did was they had different groups and tell them there's a control group, a group that focus only on this aspect of the game. Yet this group focus on this aspect, like the mines of the game. And so what they found was that whatever they told them to focus in on, that group showed significant improvement in just that component and not the others. And that was consistent between groups. So it just shows that if you can't separate something and you want to improve one aspect, you can have learners focus on one thing, and that one thing, or whatever they're focusing their attention on, can improve. Does that make sense? Yeah. Any questions, anyone? Almost done the course. I think we're like 3 slides left. No questions? Okay. So then the last topic of the course will be discussing mental practice. And so the concept is that can mental practice be effective for learning or relearning motor skills, or to prepare someone for performing a motor skill? How many of us mentally rehearse what we're going to do before we do it? Yeah. Yeah, always. I think all of us, right? And like Joshua was saying, some of us are overthinkers. We maybe do it too much, but that's an example of mental practice. And so mental practice is defined as the cognitive rehearsal of the physical skill in the absence of physical movements. So you're replaying it in your head, right? So technically, if I am doing movements, that's not mental practice. That's just practice. So mental practice can take 2 forms. You can be thinking about sort of cognitive or procedural aspects of the skill, like doing like certain components, or right, like so not imagining yourself doing it. You're thinking about, okay, this happens. Like you're thinking about the cognitive sort of problem solving of the skill, or you can imagine yourself completing the skill, or imagine yourself like in the third person, envision yourself doing it. Do you in rock climbing, really? So okay, what are the principles behind imagery or mental practice in rock climbing? So it can be the rehearsal of the cognitive aspects of the skill, or mental practice is also like sort of imagery and imagining yourself either internally or externally completing the skill. Okay. So then you know the route. So then so do you look at the wall and say, okay, I'm gonna go up here, and then kind of like you plan it out? Yeah. That's mental practice. Awesome. It's a great example. Thanks, Jacob. And so what research wanted to look at was the role of mental practice in a practice strategy to acquire a new motor skill, and the role of mental practice in a skill that we're already learned, but to prepare yourself for like game time, for example. So there's 2 roles of mental practice, and that's what research has looked at. And so what research did or has found is that mental practice is effective. It's better than no practice at all. And what this study did was they wanted to look at they remember the in pre-engine we looked at the rehabilitation pegboard where it was for patients, stroke patients. They had to practice like moving like it looked like a little wood piece from one spot to another. This study used that, and then what they did was they had groups that would have different degrees or varying percentages of mental versus physical practice. So if you look at the slide, they had a group that was all physical practice, a group that was 75% physical, 25% mental, 50% physical, 50% mental, 25% physical, 75% mental, all mental practice and control. And so what they found was all physical practice was the best. However, mental practice was significantly better than no practice at all. And so why not have, in acquiring new skills, why not have participants start with mental practice in a rehabilitation setting, because it's safe, easy, and they can start it very early in the rehab process. Maybe mental practice is helping, because remember the cognitive stages of learning, is helping with the how to do it and what to do and the problem solving component. Because the benefits of mental practice are that it can happen very early in the recovery process. So someone's lying in a medical bed, can't move, but they're going to get better over the next week. They can start with mental practice. It's inexpensive, it's cheap, it's just their mind. It can be done anywhere, and there's no safety risks. So obviously physical practice is the best to learn a motor skill, but mental practice can be added on top of that in a rehabilitation setting early on in rehabilitation, but in like sporting techniques and stuff, it can be done outside of practice. So sometimes people can get tired. You can continue on with mental practice, for example. You can add mental practice to a motor skill to acquire it and to prepare yourself for performing that skill in like a test situation. So I don't know if any of you do this. So this was just a video I found of mental imagery. Yeah, it's great for focusing, right? Here we have, this was like this was a long time ago. This was a sort of vignette that was talked about mental practice on Hockey Night in Canada.
Kids, he's visualizing, watch this now. Now look at this, I've never seen anything like this. And watch at the very end, this is a long one, he's looking right at the spot where he shot the puck. See that? He's I hear guys out there doing their sticks and everything. Isn't that something? Whatever he's doing right. Now look at you looking at that spot again. Got that spot down perfect. You look at, see that? He's getting ready to just snap that puck like that. Bobby did this? Bobby would be in the dressing room. He would not go out. Bobby would be in the afternoon at 2:30 in the afternoon, getting ready for a 7 o'clock game, just like he's getting ready, not quite as early. But Bobby would do the exact same thing. Now watch, it's that spot that he was looking. Watch that spot. Boom. And he had another great spot with it before. And see that spot? That's his spot visualizing.
So how many of us do that before like test situations or competitions? Often, yeah. It's great for focusing, and it's great to prepare the performer for performing that skill. Just like when we were talking about pre-performance rituals, where we had like the basketball player before a free throw, they have like a rhythm that they do, or the golfers before a shot, they'll like do the waggles. That's physical practice because they're moving, but you can also do it mentally. And so what that sort of indicates is that mental practice can help in two ways. It can help cognitively to help with the like problem solving or the strategies of the motor skill, but it also can be motivational. It can help hype someone up. You can imagine yourself completing it very well and prepare you for completing the motor skill. And so why is mental practice effective? I'm sure we can come up with a whole list of different reasons, but the main sort of hypotheses are through here, the three of them, and they're all sort of combined, right? It's all of them, not just one. There's the neuromuscular hypothesis that suggests that by sort of imagining yourself completing the skill, you are priming your neuromuscular system. And evidence for that hypothesis is through looking at EMG recordings of people's muscles as they're mentally sort of practicing a sort of motor skill. You get mild EMG recordings. So you may be priming the neuromuscular system. There's the brain activity hypothesis, in that you are, in going through the motor skill, you are priming the brain activity similar to the way it's going to be utilized when actually performing the motor skill. And then there's the cognitive hypothesis, in that by mentally practicing and imagining, you are sort of helping along the cognitive process of what to do, how to do it, and problem solving. And so what's really going on is probably all of them and more, right? It helps you focus attention, stops the boredom. Any other ideas? Motivational? Can you think of other reasons why mental practice is effective? Yeah, awareness, self-critique, right? Ooh, maybe so you don't learn bad habits because you're keeping your attention on it. Probably all of them, right? And so what research then wanted to do was that they wanted to evaluate mental practice in individuals for different skills. And so they wanted to know why sometimes maybe mental practice isn't good in some people and is better, or sorry, isn't as good in some people and better in others. Maybe we all have like sort of an innate imaginary or imagery ability, in that we all have like different like levels of imagery ability. And so maybe we can come up with tests to determine what level of imagery ability that you're at. And so then we can get a better idea if mental practice is best for you, or different sort of exercises to improve the imagery ability if you don't have it. So then you can benefit the most from imagery ability. It's difficult, but some studies have tried to come up with like sort of like imagery questionnaires, try to be able to like, I think like Gentile's taxonomy, try to like rank the participant. But there's been no sort of guidelines so far. So that's where research can continue. And that was the course. Any questions? Oh, Jacob's gone. That was it. Done. Well, I want to thank you all for a really good semester. It was stressful, and we had a lot of changes, and thank you for bearing with me. Oh, Jennifer has a question. The right before the exam, so that would be the 24th, right? What does it say on Canvas? Oops. Well, let's do that. 1 second. How do I? Sorry, I'm just trying to unshare so I can change it. Wait, this exam is on the 24th, correct? Is that true? Okay, so then yeah, I just have to adjust the due date. Perfect. So I will do that shortly. Okay. Again, thank you everyone for having a good semester with me. I really enjoyed sort of the back and forth. Hope to see you all in the future in some aspect. Any other sort of feedback from me, or thanks, GP. Fode doesn't know about the assignment. Yeah. Okay. If you go under the assignment folder, you have to pick a motor skill and then answer questions about it, and then email your TA.